you go to Oxford, you might, if you look carefully going down Broad Street, you'll see that there is an X or a cross there. That's because that was a very important event in the Reformation. Anybody know what's happened there? That's right. Two men were burnt at the stake there, and the memorial to that is round the corner. And this happened in 1555 at the time of Mary, the Queen of England at the time. And Latimer said to Ridley, "Be of good comfort, play the man, Master Ridley. We shall light this day such a candle that by God's grace in England, as I trust, shall never be put out." Earlier, one man had stood firm for reform. That was, of course, Luther, with his 95 Theses posted on the church at Wittenberg in, as I said earlier, in 1517. Most people would say that the Reformation dates from that date. But, of course, there was a lot leading up to it. Time hasn't permitted me to talk all about the others beforehand, but I will just pick out William Tyndale, who had translated the Bible directly from Hebrew to English. He was persecuted by Henry VIII and strangled and burnt at the stake at Vilvoorde near Brussels. He said once to a priest, "If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy who drives a plough to know more of the scripture than you do." And at his death, he said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." So our own country owes a huge amount to the Reformation. Coming back to Martin Luther, he opposed the Roman Catholic Church over the indulgences, buying reduction of time in purgatory. That was what he primarily was concerned about. He was concerned about how a person is saved. But what I do want to point out to you is that the Reformation freed men's minds and ladies' minds to think correctly on science. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the time of the Greeks, way before the time of Christ, the time of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And Socrates, I'm not going to go into all the depths of each of these men, but basically they were hugely influential in their day. How do we know anything? Socrates was asking. He was the originator of, many would say, of, at that time, the idea of critical thinking, logic and ethics. Some of the things that they said were correct. They weren't necessarily totally without foundation. Plato, his emphasis on dualism and the immortality in mind, in particular, is still thought by many today. And a lot of that thinking, some of it was not without some foundation even in Scripture. Aristotle was a student of Plato, and his emphasis was on reason and logic to give the basis of scientific understanding in the world and the universe. The reason why Aristotle is hugely important is that he talked about the four essences, if you like, of life: fire, air, water, and the earth. And he also talked about a chain of being coming from the lower plants, higher plants, jellyfish, insects, fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, and finally humans. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? And we need to recognize that this type of thinking didn't really begin with what we would consider the originator, of course, Darwin. It actually goes way back to the Greeks. The reformers, the Reformation, which I'm primarily talking about here, the reformers knew not only does truth save our souls from the judgment to come, but, and of course that was dealing with the whole issue of papal authority corrupting the teaching of salvation, But they also realized that papal authority, particularly using Aristotle, had stifled science, because what had happened was that ever since that time of Aristotle, all thinking was passed on by really a group of people studying what Aristotle thought, studying what the person who followed Aristotle thought, and so on, all the way until the time that they were living. In other words, they weren't doing separate experiments or studying the universe or studying the earth, whatever it was that they were looking at, to make their own conclusions. Don't have time to develop all this point in detail, but I would recommend that there are some books which are worth reading on this. One article in particular is this article called The Protestant Reformation and the Rise of Modern Science. This is an article in the Scottish Journal of Theology, which is very interesting and actually helps really just through one article to get quite a lot of understanding as to what was going on. Let me read to you, though, this bit in red that I've got here. The acceptance of science, this was post-Reformation now, in Protestant countries rested in part on the perceived similarity between, and I'll unpack this in a moment, between inductive study of Scripture and inductive study of nature, both in opposition to the deductivism of Aristotle. In other words, the way that we understand Scripture is to actually read it for ourselves, to compare Scripture with Scripture, and to deduce, yes, what it's saying, but also to understand that all Scripture has something to bear, maybe on the subject that we're studying, and come to a conclusion. In a similar way, you could actually look at the world and understand what that was saying to you, which is really a practical knock-on effect of Romans 1:20, that the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. This goes on to say, this article, that this was very important because it bypassed the corruptions which had been introduced by the Greek philosophical tradition, which basically ended up saying, you need to believe this because Aristotle said it. In other words, it was an authoritarian structure which had developed, and of course was very much consistent with the papal authority, which was governing everything, not only to do with salvation, but to do with the way you should live. There's another book here which is also very useful, which is Peter Harrison's book, The Bible, Protestantism and the Rise of Natural Science. Now, the scientific method that we have today grew out of this very principle which was established at the Reformation. By the way, it wasn't sort of established by one theologian stating it. It was really something which gradually developed, and people began to realize that their minds were free to look at the nature and not to necessarily look at it through the lens of what the Pope said or for what the Greeks had said before. They were just going to look at it because they found it interesting. And this overthrew the Aristotleian authoritarian worldview that I've just described. So here you've got the scientific method that we use today, and I used in my own work, that you collect data, you will then test that with experiments, you will then, coming round the bottom here, set up a hypothesis which explains the data that you've got. You'll carry on the research, and you will then actually repeat this. If we actually go clockwise round this, You may start with the data, or you may start with a hypothesis, or you may start even with an observation. Depending where you start, you will actually eventually end up going round this in a clockwise way, repeatedly in your experiments and in your theories. So let's start with hypothesis and go this way. You have a hypothesis about, well, let's take Kepler, for instance. He was looking at the way the planets went, and he was thinking, well, maybe they don't quite go in the way people have said, and he set up a hypothesis that they could be going around with an ellipse, which is in fact what happens. He tests with experiment or observations. He looks at the data. He makes a report to himself or maybe to others. Then he looks at the observations again, and so he will go around and adjust it. That, of course, is what happened, and then a lot of problems arose because some people began to doubt what the Greeks had said about the way the planets went. We'll come to that in a moment. So here are some very great scientists who are from this new tradition of science which grew out of the Reformation. People like Isaac Newton, well known, of course, Robert Boyle, Michael Faraday, Kepler that I've just referred to, later on Maxwell, Kelvin, and others that I've put there. Let's consider then how they viewed the universe or the immediate solar system under the Greeks, because this illustrates how the new scientific method which came out of the Reformation affected the way the science was done. Ptolemy, who was part of the Greek tradition, of course, had suggested that the way really to understand the solar system was to put the Earth at the centre, and all the stars, yes, we'll come to those, but we'll first of all consider the sun and the planets, the most immediate ones that he could see at that time in history that had been observed, are circles going round the Earth. Then when it came to the stars, as that picture on the right shows, you know, they were regarded as being in a dome or just outside a dome, and that they were sort of pointing like little cracks in that dome of light going around the Earth. Well, of course, that led to real trouble, as you well know. Or most of you will know that if you put the Earth at the centre, you will have a bit of a problem with the planets, because at times they appear to go backwards. Jupiter appears to go on a backwards trend and then appears to carry on. The same happens with all the planets, in fact. And so in order to make this work, what they had to do was they had to introduce what were called epicycles to explain this. Well, that's all very well, and that you can make it work, but in the end, people had to correct the first epicycles by lots of sub-epicycles and even sub-epicycles to make it fit the observations. And everything got so complicated that eventually some people began to ask questions and say, well, is this really the way to understand what is going on? That's another picture of the same issue where the Earth is regarded as being at the centre. Copernicus is the one that most people realise was the one who particularly said, well, how about if we have the sun at the centre? And that, of course, made a lot of sense, because now one could understand the way that the planets were going from our viewpoint, because really they were going primarily not round us, but round the sun. And of course that explains why there is an apparent indication to us that sometimes they go in the reverse motion. But that's not the reality. It can all be explained because the planets are really going around the sun. Well, you probably know that there was a bit of a bust-up which happened when Galileo came onto the scene. Because he was following the Copernican, not discovery, but the Copernican suggestion. And he didn't challenge, as many people try to put to us who are not Christians, try to say that, we represent a biblical view, and Galileo was actually challenging the biblical view. No, he wasn't. He was actually challenging a view which had been pushed under the Pope's leadership, which really goes back to the Aristotelian thinking. The Ptolemy view of the universe was not something that really could be developed from a biblical concept. It was something that had come from the Greeks and had overlaid the interpretation of the Bible. And so when Galileo had this difficulty with what was then the Roman Catholic Church dominating everything, it wasn't that it was the Bible which was really at stake. It was the church's misrepresentation of what the Bible was saying, and also the Greek thinking which he was challenging. So this demonstrates the principle that the Reformation enabled men and women of science to actually look at observations and to deduce from those observations a theory which could be tested by experiment, and that the whole scientific method flourished as a result of the Reformation. In John 8, verse 36, it says, "If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." This is so much at the heart of the explosion of science in the centuries following the Reformation. Not only science, but the arts and the humanities, all subjects grew out of the Reformation because of the massive effect that the Reformation had in freeing men's minds to think correctly, not to slavishly follow one other person who himself had been a slave of somebody else, which is really what had happened to understanding the world around us. So not only Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Kepler, who of course, whom I quoted earlier, realised that the way to understand the planets was that they were following ellipses, a path of an ellipse going around the sun, and that the sun was at one of the foci of those ellipses. But of course then we have Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, who set up a very important society. In fact, it is the oldest society in the world for science, or perhaps we should say the oldest national scientific institution. So the first country to set up a national scientific institution was in fact in our own country, the Royal Society. And it's very interesting when you read the early articles about the foundation of the Royal Society, that it was founded to acquire knowledge through experimental investigation. Please note, that's a very vital point. They were basically taking the scientific method and saying this is the way to understand the world. It was not against science. Beg your pardon, it was not against the Bible. It was actually the Bible which had freed men's minds and ladies' minds. They come into it. Obviously, the culture very much affected what was going on in terms of who was leading the show. But men, women were following that tradition, that new tradition, began to make wonderful discoveries. Some people would say the only good thing that Charles II did, but certainly one of the good things that Charles II did, was to set up a group of scientists and philosophers who, of course, then set up the Royal Society. And I love this wonderful first edition of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And it says here, rather lovely, set up 1665 and 1666. And I think it says something else here. Oh yes, that's right. At the bottom, it says, presented by the author, May the 30th, 1667. And it's beautifully put. But anyway, that's a detail. But that's the setting up of the first, if you like, the scientific meeting. Now, this can be summarised, and I need to hurry up to try and not delay lunch too much. The Reformation led to the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is it has this sense of renewal. Wonderful architecture came into this time, music, and not only the scientific discoveries, but then it leads to what the world will call the Enlightenment. But I don't call it the Enlightenment, I call it the Endarkment. Because the Endarkment was a resistance against the biblical thinking. The Renaissance essentially begins, in most people's thinking, at the end of the 17th century, as I say, with the setting up of the Royal Society in Science and all the wonderful buildings and everything, and the architecture is just absolutely wonderful. If you go to all the major capitals in Europe, you see it all, particularly in Vienna and many places like that. But the Endarkment, or the Enlightenment, is the technical term for it, really is typified by the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And what really the Enlightenment, the Endarkment as I've called it, is typifying particularly is man-centered thinking and a reversal to the Greek belief in the ladder of life. The questioning of biblical concepts is very much at the heart of a good part of the Enlightenment. Now, I won't say everything was questioning, but a huge amount was questioning the original premises of the Reformation. However, there were some things which were being done in this early period of the Renaissance which we shouldn't forget. For instance, Carolus Linnaeus is still referred to today for his tremendous work on taxonomy. We had the word taxonomy used in a slightly different way earlier, but taxonomy, the study of creatures, the labelling of creatures, saying that this creature is different to that. This is a family of creatures. And people still consider Linnaeus as one of the most tremendous persons actually classifying nature, and he's still referred to today. Now, Erasmus Darwin, though, is really a product of the Enlightenment. Really. What? Oh dear. Coming back?
It'll come back.
A few million years. Yes, a few million microseconds. God again. Stop breathing. And then, it comes back. Right. Now, this is a very interesting quote from Zoonomia, which he wrote in 1794. Notice how it concurs with the beginning of the Enlightenment period. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time, since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament? Written, of course, in very old language, but it's basically the beginnings of evolutionary thinking again, back to the Greeks. It's not really the beginning, it's really picking up what the Greeks had said before. Evolution, then, I'm suggesting to you, is a backward step to the pre-Reformation Greek philosophy of Aristotle. So this famous diagram by Charles Darwin, beginning his idea of the tree of life, is really not new. And a lot of what Darwin did, not all, but a lot of it was thinking which had built on what others had thought before. His grandfather was thinking in Greek terms. Now, some of his work, by the way, is very interesting. He did a lot of observations on slugs. Did you know that? And it's still referred to today, quite rightly, because some of what Darwin did was just simply very interesting observations along the Linnaean principles. But of course he got influenced not only by his grandfather but by Charles Lyell, who was very much in the same way as Erasmus Darwin and others, who had now developed the idea that of long ages, the principles which he talks about in the Principles of Geology. Darwin, the young Darwin, read Charles Lyell's... Sorry, I'm getting distracted by this machine not working. Anyway, you saw it earlier. So Charles Lyell's thinking was rooted in the long ages of time, the chain of being of the Greeks. So then he was proposing the millions of years, and he was, in my view, and most of us here would think this, that this hypothesis of evolution plus assumptions is not based on firm experimentation. So you need to realize that what was happening was it was a development of an idea which was not based on this scientific model which had grown out of the Reformation, which says that we need to test and see whether a hypothesis is correct or not. Indeed, when you actually look at the evolutionary thinking, they actually admit that they are refusing the idea of the possibility of a supernatural creation. They deny a supernatural creator. Richard Lewontin, many years ago, said, materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And of course, that is a religious statement. So what was happening is that as we moved into the 20th century and now to today, you've got a scientific method which was proposed beforehand and was even agreed was a very good thing to do, but now has quietly been put to one side and been replaced by dogma. So you've gone back to the way the Greeks thought. And of course, what we have today, which is the idea that we've all begun from a pea soup of chemicals 4.5 billion years ago, and before that a big bang to produce all the various planets and all the rest of it, has become the new religion that is believed by most people in the West and even in the East as well. So I want to now just jump because of time and just refer you back to the Royal Society. So I'm jumping because I don't want to spend too much time delaying dinner. So I asked the question, oh dear, I'm getting distracted. I asked the question, whatever happens to the Royal Society motto, which you may have noticed in the earlier slide, is nullius in verba, which means on the word of no one. Remember that I said that the Royal Society was set up coming out of the Reformation, saying, we're not going to just follow something because somebody says it. We're going to test, and we're going to actually do experiments. We're going to do great engineering, which is what happened as a result. And we're going to build new ideas based on understanding proper, careful experimentation. What then happened to that? Well, this was the original setting up, the determination of the fellows to withstand the domination of authority and to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment. And yet, we do have some admitting, even in modern papers, that what has happened is that a doctrine has emerged. A doctrine has emerged of common descent, and this has even been produced in a recent, well, relatively recent paper, where this person who is not justifying the position we would take, but is admitting that, let me read the quote to you. We cannot expect to explain cellular evolution if we stay locked in the classical Darwinian mode of thinking. The time has come for biology to go beyond the doctrine of common descent. In other words, he's admitting that a lot of that which has been guiding his colleagues has been bowing down to the idol of common descent, which is an evolutionary deduction, rather than actually just looking at the evidence. So what we need is to get back to this correct way of doing science, and this overthrew the Aristotleian authoritarian worldview concerning how to understand the world around you. That's epistemology, and that is the way that we should go again. That's, of course, what happens when you take a proper creation view and take it with you into doing your science. Romans 1:20 says, the invisible things of him, the Lord God, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. How interesting that Michael Gove said some months ago, or some years ago now, the person prepared to place themselves outside the consensus and articulate the case against the conventional wisdom is the true hero of history, because it is only when authority is challenged that progress is secured. If science ceases to be a rebellion against authority, do you see that interesting quote there? Then it does not deserve the talents of our brightest children. So in other words, science shouldn't be governed by dogma. And that's a very important point as we do science today. So I need to close, and I remind you then of that verse that I had up earlier, that when we do true science, we look at the science knowing that it reveals an awful lot about the mind of God, and it tells us many things about the world around us, but it also should not be separated from God himself, who reveals himself in a measure through the world that he has made. However, we must say that all the scientists who initially were Christians in this, taking the science in this way, recognized that the difference between looking at the world around us and the Bible is that we have imperfect minds, that our minds are fallible. So whereas some people, as was referred to in the first talk, take this to be the two books approach, and they are making a mistake because they then regard the world around them as being perfectly understood through minds which they should admit are imperfect. So there is huge dangers of doing science with a pride which removes God from your thinking. The best minds recognize that the world is marred, we are marred, and that we look at the world around us with a humble spirit, realizing that God has revealed himself, that we can learn from it, and if we do careful experiments, we can sometimes get it right, and we can even build rockets, build aeroplanes, as has happened, all flowing out of a new view of science coming from the Reformation. But it was even non-Christian scientists like Einstein who had a much greater humility than many scientists today, because even he talked about there must be something, some mind behind which has actually caused the motion of the spheres. Even he had humility to recognize that there was something behind the universe that he was looking at. And of course Faraday, whom he greatly respected, openly acknowledged the great God who had made everything. So did James Clerk Maxwell. Many of the early scientists were great Christians. So true science has grown out of the Reformation. Thank you.